Hi guys, today I wanted to talk about false prophets. And if that's too religious to you, we could also call it false teachers. But these are spiritual times. In these times when one era is about to end, and I mean the current system, when the dark powers are losing, they make every attempt to turn it around. They throw punches in all directions. And one of these characteristics are false prophets, which shoot out of the ground like mushrooms wherever you look. In particular, they try to deceive in a last attempt to bring people off course. One other reason why we see this is that in these very polarizing times, everyone has to make a commitment to either commit to one direction or another. When the issue is so pressing like the current one, there's no middle ground. So everyone has to make a decision. And even the third way, that you don't make a decision, doesn't work here. Normally, going with a crowd, with a mass, is an evolutionary strategy to protect yourselves. If you're surrounded by others, it is very unlikely that it will hit you. But in these times it's different. If you follow the crowd, if you put your head in the sand, you just run over the cliff and you make really stupid and lethal decisions. So regarding the false prophets, there are several characteristics. At a first glance, false prophets look like real prophets, making meaningful and powerful propositions. However, in reality, they're just con artists. So there are several characteristics which we find in the following examples. Ultimately, all of them are pushing the propaganda to take the poisonous vaccine. Also, clearly none of the people I will show have taken it or will take it. Okay, let's get started. So first, let's look at the Queen. So even if you don't like the royal family, and I suppose most people watching this won't like them, she seems to be the most genuine person. She is certainly walking, talking history. She lived through a lot and had at difficult times a calming role. But you have to keep in mind, as she never worked in her life, even if the population of the UK completely declines because of the events unfolding, she will keep her wealth, the land, the buildings. She doesn't need anyone. She has everything. And in the end, who wants Prince Charles to be king? The royal family wouldn't survive this transition. So why not get rid of everyone? From her perspective. Let's see what she says.
Well, once you've had the vaccine, you have a feeling of, you're protected, which is, I think, very important.
One feature of a false prophet is a downplay of danger. She feels protected. She is an old lady, so if she could take it, then anyone can take it. Of course, neglecting the side effects.
As far as I can make out, it was quite harmless.
Quite harmless, so that's a qualifying statement. It's different from saying it's harmless. So again, downplaying it.
It was very quick.
Quick, another downplay.
And I've had lots of letters from people who've been very surprised by how easy it was.
Of course it's easy, that's not the point. Again, more downplay.
To get the vaccine. And the jab was it didn't hurt at all.
Feeling the pain of the needle for a millisecond wouldn't stop people from getting it. Every time I go to the dentist, I get a local anesthetics, and I don't mind.
We hope everyone who is offered the vaccine will take it up because it is their best. It is all of our best chance.
That's not very convincing. She's reading it off. This doesn't look very authentic. And she has these massive shoulder shrugs, meaning she's completely uncertain herself.
To protect both the people who take up the vaccine, their families and their communities.
Very unconvincing.
I think the other thing is
now she read off her list what else she can bring, what other argument.
That it is obviously difficult for people to, if they've never had a vaccine, because they ought to think about other people rather than themselves.
So there were two things now. So another feature of false prophets is the mockery. So she makes fun of the people who don't want the poisonous vaccine by comparing them with the anti-vaxxers who don't want any vaccines. I think a lot of people had vaccines before, safe vaccines, and they just don't want this one. The last thing she is using guilt. Think of others. And she says this as the richest person in England. Think of others. So we have downplay of the negative adverse side effects, which can be lethal. She uses mockery to make fun of them by comparing them with anti-vaxxers, and she uses guilt to pressure people into it. And clearly, she never took the vaccine. So now we switch to talk radio and the interview of Peter Hitchens by Mike Graham. Talk radio looks like a critical radio station, but a year into the pandemic, they still debate the obvious things. This radio station and similar Unheard, which is next, can be considered superficially critical, but at the core following the mainstream agenda. They could be called planned resistance, guiding the critical people with a false flag into the wrong direction. So Talk Radio is funded by the Wireless Group, which was bought by media mogul Robert Murdoch in 2016. Here Peter Hitchens is interviewed, where he admits that he took the vaccine. So he is a Mail on Sunday columnist and has been so far be a lockdown opponent. Now people feel disappointed and let down. So people didn't follow his false narrative apparently. But let's have a quick look.
It's now time to say a very, very good morning to Peter Hitchens. Peter, very good morning to you.
Morning.
Now, who knew when you put out your column on Sunday that you would become the focus of such appropriate...
So he's breathing in very heavily. He's certainly upset. He didn't think it would backfire that way. He's personally hit. And he looks fearful. So either he's fearful that people find out that he didn't take it, or he really took it and he's fearful that people just reject him. And you know, for a popular person, the worst thing is to become unpopular.
And nastiness from people who thought that somehow you'd betrayed them, gone over to the other side, you know, finally sort of chucked in the towel and, you know, you must have been a shill all along kind of stuff.
Well, I wasn't actually terribly surprised, but I thought that it was something I was almost going to have to endure. I decided to tell people I had the last vaccination because I believe very much honesty is the best policy. I could perfectly easily have concealed it from everybody. Nobody ever...
But he didn't. He used it for propaganda. So what is his strategy as a false prophet? He's representing the wounded heart, the likable anti-hero, the heroically failed person who wants to pull down people with him. And we see this as a false flag operation because the like-dislike ratio was disabled initially of this video. So that was not meant as an honest debate. It was propaganda. And here he uses fake populist metaphors as propaganda to trick people. We will see in a second.
Even know. So quite, but I've actually often found that in the short term, honesty is seldom the best policy in the short term because it's pelted with slime. In the long term, it has advantages, but the whole response has been completely irrational. I've admitted, as it was time to do.
So he's stuttering around a lot, and it looks like he's nervous, and this is a sign of telling lies, but this is how he normally speaks.
An opportunity to do that. It's quite plain that the skeptical campaign, although it had all the best arguments and certainly won the debate, has lost the contest for the hearts and minds of the British people. Acceptance of the new health and safety state and of its restrictions is extraordinarily high levels.
So here, this is propaganda. He sells a fake idea that the majority wants this vaccine and this is the best policy. If you show the likes and dislikes, you will see there's no vast majority for the vaccine.
I still see, and my barometer for this is the number of people I see walking around in the open air, sometimes actually in the countryside, with masks over their mouths and noses. No law requires them to do this. They do it voluntarily because they believe in the COVID cult, and the COVID cult is extraordinarily extensive. If you lose an election, for example, which I think is a similar thing to the loss which the skeptics have undergone, by conceding that you've lost the election, you don't concede that your ideas are wrong. The losing party doesn't put its hand and say, "No, we're terribly sorry, everything we said was wrong, we're now going to commit ritual suicide and vanish from sight." What they do is they go back and think, well, how can we actually try and get our ideas across better in future, and how can we get what we want in other ways? And that's what you have to do. Before you do that, you have to concede defeat, otherwise you end up like the...
But clearly defeat doesn't mean you take a poisonous vaccine. So there's a big difference, and he uses these very populist metaphors to trick people.
And we now come into spring. What's happened, of course, is that the vaccine has become the exit ticket, which most people think that it's become the exit ticket.
So most people, I doubt it. Again, tricking you with very simple metaphors.
And the government was successfully able to spin an extension of lockdown last week into what it claims to be an announcement of coming release. And most people took that. It was a beautiful example of the propagandist art. The Prime Minister actually announced a lengthy extension of the lockdown, which began on January the 4th. But because he said that there might be in future some relaxations, it was generally spun and reported and believed as a promise for future release. May happen, but who knows? Brazilian new variant, whatever it may be.
So he's warming up a little bit. He feels now more comfortable because he has been talking for a while.
Kindly pointed out that you've never been in any way recommending that people shouldn't take the vaccine. But an awful lot of people who seem disappointed with you doing it seem to be...
Mike brings back the discussion to the disappointment by the viewers. And now we see again how fearful he looks. So he's personally hurt by that.
We're going to find that the travel involves an awful lot of being held in quarantine hotels and having sticks jabbed up your nose and down your throat before you can move, and also being made to pay an awful lot of extra money. The point that I made in my column was that I won't go into tear-jerking details, but there are very important to me close members of my family who I have not now seen for more than a year, and I'm sick of that. And if getting this stupid injection is the price to pay for it, then it's one I'm perfectly willing to pay. I haven't, as I said, made any difference.
Bingo. Now, by personalizing the story, by talking about his family, we all feel touched because we all have the situation. At least I have. And so he's stepping on our side, persuading us that all you need to do is take the vaccine to get out of this. So here's again the downplaying of the danger and the seductive part. But I think this trickery failed if we look at the likes and dislikes. So now I come to the alternative media channel Unheard with Lockdown TV, led by Freddie Sayer. And this is another planned resistance channel. It appears critical at first sight, but ultimately never comes to a conclusion. But a year into the pandemic, the video still debates the obvious things. There's no progress. Also, the facts are very clear now. The videos are very well cut. There's a big team. It's a glamorous website. There's certainly money behind it, and it's not obvious how it is funded.
I think we shouldn't be striving for a new normal. We should really want, as much as possible, the old normal back. So actually we can see our loved ones, we can have that level of social interaction. We're a social species. And I think, a lot of the...
So here again, the seductive part. All this speaks to us. It's like the Great Reset, about protecting the environment, about equality. Yes, it sounds all great. But this is how we get sucked in. And then there's the real evil parts, which you realize only much later. So this little clip is already seducing us, a listener, to buy into this.
Dystopian discussion of a new normal actually really scares me, because I think we lose that level of
I completely agree with everything he said.
social interaction that actually keeps us going.
Hello and welcome. This is Lockdown TV from Unheard. We are called Lockdown TV because we began life on day one of lockdown here in the UK, and that is nigh on a year ago. We've been in and out of some form of...
This channel is way too glamorous. Fred appears way too unconcerned, way too cheerful. He is not feeling the pressure. The whole channel in the ultimate narrative is very PC, very woke. On LinkedIn, he wrote article, "Bring on the vaccine, bring an end to the lockdown." And another one, inside the Zero COVID campaign. Zero COVID is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. It's impossible to achieve. With any false positive rate of the PCR tests, you can't possibly achieve zero COVID. That's just blackmail to take vaccines or eternal lockdown.
Extreme restrictions ever since then, and a lot of the decision of how we come out of it and what metrics we should use to come out of it.
So he is enjoying himself way too much for a critical, concerned journalist.
It involves modelling, and there's even a special committee that advises the government called SPI-M, the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Modelling, and they feed into SAGE, the
So more modeling feeds into more modeling, and no one can blame responsibility because they're all part of an interlinked chain which goes round and round.
government committee, and a member of that, I'm delighted to say, is joining us now. He's called Dr. Mike Tilsley. Hi, Mike.
Good afternoon.
So you are one of these modelers, and you are directly advising the government. So they are listening to you as to when they can start releasing restrictions and when life can start getting back to normal. What are you advising them?
Whatever the government considers important at any point in time, SPI-M may look at and provide advice to the government in terms of what should do. Now, the key thing here is advice. We are advisors, we are not decision makers.
So he doesn't want any of the blame, no responsibility. So the government follows the science, and the science just says they're providing advice. So no one is responsible in this little charade.
And of course, the government have a range of different things they need to look at when it comes to making a decision as to what to do.
But as far as we normal people are concerned, we really only care about one thing, which is when is life going to get back to normal? So given all these different investigations you're doing and the overall advice you're giving the government, what's your best guess?
I think the key thing for us when it comes to relaxing lockdown is the need to do it gradually. We do know that any kind of relaxation is going to impact the R number, but we do have some good news. The vaccination campaign's going really well, far better actually than I thought it would have done at the start of January. If we can keep
more arbitrary metrics, more about R numbers, more pushing vaccines, all the same, all propaganda.
that trajectory going, and these vaccines work, and they have a high level of protection, not just from severe symptoms, but also in terms of blocking transmission, we could be in a position that by the summer we have
No acknowledgements of the side effects of the scores of people dying.
dramatically eased lockdown, but it's really dependent upon getting a high level of uptake of vaccine, even in the non-vulnerable groups. So,
See, pushing without evidence the vaccine to be taken up by everyone, ultimately reducing the population with a poisonous vaccine.
By the summer, dramatically ease lockdown
So he is not concerned.
doesn't sound that great, I would say, from what we were sort of expecting. We were told when the big moment in November that the vaccines arrived, it was the Prime Minister said, health is coming on the horizon, so we're going to stay locked down until the vaccines arrive, and vaccines were...
Okay, now we get the message. We got it. Repeated 100 times. Lockdown until the vaccine.
arrived. We're now really going through them at a pace. I think by, I think it's April, most of the over 65s will have been offered the vaccine, and a little bit after that, the over 50s. I mean, At that point, the vast majority of potential deaths are protected by a vaccine.
Vaccine protected. In fact, the data shows they're dying.
What's stopping us reopening at that point?
So with the vaccines, they have a high level of protection, possibly about, let's say 90%, just to make it easy, 90% for severe symptoms. That's then 10% of the population that are vaccinated that are not immune. Now, if we have an R number of about 1, then we will see the deaths and the hospitalizations go.
So we discussed the R numbers a year ago and still debating the R number. This goes nowhere.
Down dramatically. But of course, as we start easing things, then, and the R number goes up.
The good thing is that after the Great Awakening, none of the people we see here, including the Queen, will play any role anymore. There won't be any royal family anymore, and all these talking bullshit people will be gone one way or another. No one will care about them anymore. No one will listen to them anymore once it is clear that all was a big lie. All will be gone. So let's look at another interview on Unheard. This is by Lord Sumption, a retired Supreme Court judge, an outspoken apparent critic of the lockdowns. A lot of things I would sign up for. I completely agree with a lot of things. But half into this interview, we realize what it is really about. It's another example of seduction to trick people into the vaccines. So the vaccine take-up is the ultimate goal of all these interviews.
Who has, for the past year, been one of the most outspoken and visible opponents of lockdowns as a policy. Welcome, Lord Sumption.
I'm glad to be here.
Let's just start with the kind of key basic question. What about these mandatory stay-at-home orders and lockdowns did you find unacceptable, so much so that you felt you had to speak out about it?
Well, I regard myself as a liberal with a small L. Until the COVID outbreak, that was a very middle-of-the-road position to be in. Since the outbreak, it's become controversial and, even in some people's minds, extreme. This is, I think, some indication of how far our national psychology has moved. I do not believe that liberty is an absolute value. I think that there are circumstances where it's necessary to override it, but one has to be very careful to reserve that for extreme cases. And I do not regard COVID-19 as an extreme case.
So this goes on for half an hour, and it's all very agreeable. And you look at him, he is liberal, he is an outspoken critic of the lockdowns, he has the artist liberal haircut, and similar with Freddie. So you think you can trust these people. And this trust is built up. But after 30 minutes, he all of a sudden is pro-vaccine passports. And this is when the coin drops. And even though they look very trustworthy, you can't dress something ugly and evil up and turn it into something nice by putting cream and a cherry and sugar on top. Vaccine passports force people to take vaccines, which lead to genocide and discrimination of people who don't want to take it.
So what do we do about it, Lord Sumption? We're facing quite a bleak prospect here. Can you think of any measures that will start to kind of buttress those things that we need to be strong in order to go back to it?
She is becoming more and more cheerful, building up to the vaccine issue.
Eventually one reaches a stage where people get as fed up with despotic governments as they have recently become with democratic ones, possibly with better reason.
Isn't the reality also that people who are vaccinated will behave?
So now it's back to the vaccinations. Thank you, Fred.
Differently, whether you officially recognise it in law or not. So you're essentially encouraging people to ignore regulations.
Well, the government is doing its best to pretend that the vaccine makes a difference and at the same time that it doesn't make a difference. This is a position that is internally irreconcilable. And the basic problem, I think, is the basic problem is coercion. If you adopt coercion as your way of influencing public behaviour, you have to have rules that are capable of being enforced. And that is one of the major factors that makes the current system so despotic and so irrational.
So in your system, there would be recommendations that if you had the vaccine, we recommend you behave like this.
Vaccine.
That is how Sweden has worked from the outset, with very minor exceptions, which is how we intended to work. That was the plan before the 23rd of March. It was the advice of SAGE, which said that people have got to be treated like adults capable of making their own decisions and their own assessments. This was 10 years of science-based planning that was thrown out the window in a panic at the end of March.
But different behaviours for the vaccinated and non-vaccinated, in a lot of people's minds will start making them think about vaccine passports and documents that show which stream you're in, which poses new problems.
So he's gloating with the vaccine passports. So he is really one of them. This is not an alternative critical channel.
I think that we have got to choose the least bad thing. And to my mind, a vaccine passport is a lot less bad than simply indiscriminately depriving everybody of what makes life worth living.
Whoa. Okay, so the coin dropped. So all about vaccines and uptake and passports, even so he admits this discriminates people, not talking about the side effects, so all propaganda. Okay, so with all these examples, I wanted to illustrate how false prophets work. They can look on the surface as critical alternative people, but they use different methods to disguise a message, to trick people. So there's an approach of downplaying any adverse effects or issues or just neglecting them. Second, there's an approach using guilt to pressure people. Think of others, the propaganda line. Third, which is the least favorable option, is to use mockery to make fun of people who think differently. So all of this can be grouped together under a planned resistance movement in a last attempt to get people off course. But I personally think the Great Awakening is happening and it can't be stopped anymore, even with subtle propaganda. So with this positive note, I look into the future and I will talk to you next time. Bye.